power vacuum left by Caesar's death. If the liberators thought they were going to restore the Republic by letting Mark Antony anywhere near power, they were mistaken, bordering on delusional. As Cicero later said, the Ides of March was a fine deed, but half done. Letting Antony live was incredibly short-sighted. Finally, the assassins completely miscalculated the people's reaction to the death of Caesar. The liberators, who were all high-born senators, seemed to have been living in something of a bubble. They saw Caesar as a dangerous tyrant. Removing him from power was a self-evident good. But the lower and middle classes saw Caesar not as a dangerous tyrant, but as a powerful advocate of their interests, a man who had always gone to bat for them against the oligarchy of wealthy princes who never gave them the time of day, who gobbled up their land, hoarded the profits of empire, and forced them to live wretched lives in urban slums. If the liberators thought murdering Caesar was going to make them heroes to the people, they understood nothing about how the average Roman lived. They would pay a price for their blindness. In just a matter of days, these men who thought themselves heroes, who believed they had just delivered Rome from one of history's greatest monsters, would find themselves on the run, their homes ransacked, and their heads called for by the enraged masses of Rome. Perplexed, and perhaps a bit offended that the liberators had not thought him worthy of assassination, Mark Antony returned to Rome a few days after the Ides of March, quietly reassuming the consulship which, with Caesar now gone, was once again the highest office in the land. The first order of business was to open Caesar's will and find out how the late dictator planned to allocate his power and fortune. Calpurnia had retrieved the documents from their deposit box at the Temple of the Vestas and turned them over to Antony as soon as he was back in the city. What Antony read disheartened him. Despite his years of service and loyalty, he was accorded no official place among Caesar's heirs. Instead, incredibly, Caesar left 3/4 of his fortune to his practically unknown and certainly untested 19-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius. Even more incredibly, Caesar stipulated in the will that he was adopting Octavius posthumously. Just like that, Antony was faced with a dangerous rival for power. He had assumed that with their old general dead, the loyalty of Caesar's legions would naturally pass to his chief lieutenant. But now, suddenly, there was a son of Caesar. Would the legions rally to this upstart, or would they stick with the man who had shared their barracks and mess tents through all these long years of war and hardship? It was not a rhetorical question. Across the empire, the legions who had pledged themselves personally to Caesar would now be faced with a choice: the son or the battle. Gaius Octavius, the man who would become Caesar Augustus, was born during the consulship of Cicero in 63 BC. He was the son of an up-and-coming novus homo, also named Gaius Octavius, who had been recognized as a rising star and married to Julius Caesar's niece Appia. However, when young Gaius was only 5, his father had died, and his mother remarried a cautious politician named Lucius Marcius Philippus. His early years were spent primarily in the care of his grandmother, Caesar's sister Julia, who oversaw his education until she died in 51 BC. There did not seem to be anything particularly remarkable about the boy, certainly nothing to indicate that in a few years he would become, the master of the known world. In fact, he seemed to lack all the qualities that mark young Roman boys for greatness. He was fragile, prone to sickness, not particularly strong, and forever hovered over by an overprotective mother. But he was an able student, showed promise in oratory, and most critically, seemed to attract the right kind of friends. It was at school, for example, that he met Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the low-born son of a nobody, who was immediately drawn to the thoughtful, if frail, young aristocrat. Agrippa was everything that Octavius was not, a physically gifted natural athlete who impressed every old soldier he ever came across. As much as Caesar was eventually struck by the clever mind and solid character of his young nephew, he was never under any illusions about the boy's physical prowess. But in the friends Octavius surrounded himself with, Agrippa in particular, Caesar felt comforted that the boy was in good hands. Indeed, throughout the coming civil wars, when Octavian is described as having won this or that battle, what historians really mean to say is that Agrippa won this or that battle for Octavian. The childhood friends conquered the empire together, Octavian handling the politics, Agrippa the armies. It was one of the most successful partnerships in history. Young Octavius did not come into regular contact with his famous uncle until Caesar returned triumphant from North Africa. He had been forbidden to join the campaign by his mother, who feared the boy would break under the stress of army life. But when Caesar emerged victorious from the civil war, Octavius found himself in the unique position of being related to the most powerful man in Rome. He was bombarded from all sides by people looking to use his special access to procure favors, appointments, and handouts. But at the time, he was basically just a kid and had no reason to think he had any pull whatsoever with his uncle, so what the heck were they bothering him for? Famously, though, Octavius finally mustered the gumption to approach Caesar and ask a favor. Agrippa's brother had been on the losing side of the North African War, but having already been pardoned by Caesar once before, he had no hope of clemency, as it was well known that Caesar's generosity was extended one time only. Getting caught on the wrong side a second time meant death. Caesar granted the request of his young nephew without hesitation, though, to the relief of both Octavius, who feared provoking the wrath of his uncle, and Agrippa, whose brother's life hung in the balance. That Octavius took such a personal risk for Agrippa cemented their bond forever and earned Octavius a well-deserved reputation for loyalty. Without a legitimate male heir, Caesar had his eye on Octavius, and when the Pompey brothers started trouble in Spain, he intended to place the young man on his general staff and test his military mettle. But as the legions were preparing to march from Rome, Octavius was felled by one of his frequent sicknesses and had to be left behind. Unfortunately for Octavius, his early career would be riddled by these untimely sicknesses. You know, the kind of sicknesses that keep you confined to a tent when you should be out on the battlefield. So, whether deserved or not, along with his reputation for loyalty, young Octavius would soon acquire a damaging reputation for cowardice as well. There is no indication that he was ever faking sick, but once too often the legions marched off and left him behind to mend from some new affliction. Eventually, people started to notice a pattern. But Octavius was determined to make it to Spain, so when he recovered, he set out with a small cadre of friends, Agrippa included, to join Caesar at the front. But if he hoped to get his first taste of battle, he was too late. By the time he reached Spain, the war was already over. But it was not a total loss. Caesar had Octavius stay with him in his tent, and when the legions packed up and headed back to Rome, Octavius spent most of the journey in his uncle's carriage, picking the brain and having his brain picked by the great general. And despite his late arrival, he earned the respect of Caesar for having set out on his journey before knowing the outcome of the war, unlike the endless stream of politicians who waited to find out who won before pouring out of Rome to find Caesar and pay their respects. Octavius, though, was eventually dislodged from his prime seat alongside Caesar when Mark Antony joined the caravan in Gaul. Octavius found himself in the next carriage back, seated alongside Decimus Brutus, one of Marcus Brutus's cousins, and a longtime supporter of Caesar, who would soon join the Liberator conspiracy and then play a central role in the early stages of the post-Ides of March civil wars between the Senate, Octavius, and the man who had just taken Octavius' spot in Caesar's carriage, Mark Antony. At some point during the journey home from Spain, Caesar made up his mind about Octavius, and when they returned to Rome, one of the first things he did was rewrite his will, officially declaring that in the event of his death, Octavius was to be posthumously adopted and put in charge of the family and fortune of the Julii. As an ironic historical footnote, the will also stipulated that Octavius was dead or refused the inheritance, then everything should go to Marcus Brutus, the man Caesar had always loved and treated as his son. Et tu, Brute? To prepare Octavius for a life at the forefront of war, politics, and empire, Caesar introduced his new heir. Not that anyone, Octavius included, knew that Caesar had rewritten his will at this point, to the life of an all-powerful official. The young man acted as a sort of administrative assistant, serving as an intermediary between the hordes of men who wanted 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, with Caesar, and the man himself, who did not physically have time for them all. Octavius learned quickly how politics really worked, what was important, what could be left for another day, who should be flattered, and who could safely be ignored. After this crash course in practical administration, Caesar arranged for Octavius to complete his education in Apollonia, where he would learn oratory from the Greek masters and soldiering from the Macedonian legions. Then, in a few months, when Rome launched its invasion of Parthia, Octavius would serve alongside Caesar and learn his final, most valuable lessons. But of course, Octavius would never learn those final lessons from his uncle. Word came from his mother in a letter dated March 15, 44 BC, that Caesar was dead. Even though she did not yet know the content of Caesar's will, Simply by virtue of being a male relative of the murdered dictator, Attia knew that her son was in danger. She implored Octavius to return to Rome, but avoid getting entangled in the public fallout of the assassination. This request directly contradicted the advice Octavius received from his friends and mentors in Apollonia, who encouraged him to immediately take command of the 5 legions in Macedonia, march on Rome, and avenge his uncle. While making no commitment to a private life as his mother wished, Octavius rejected the notion that he could or should lead 25,000 men in an illegal invasion of Italy. He had never even witnessed a battle, let alone fought one, and at this point, he had very real doubts about whether or not he was cut out to be a general. So he split the difference and decided to travel back to Italy with a small company of allies and figure out what his role would be in this new post-Caesar world. He arrived in Brundisium and carefully approached the legions that had been mustered there for the now-cancelled Parthian campaign. He found himself well received by the soldiers and in no immediate danger from the anti-Caesar faction. Apparently, back in Rome, Antony had delivered a funeral oration in the Forum while Caesar lay in state, and had whipped the masses into an anti-liberator frenzy. He told them that Caesar had always held the people at the forefront of his mind, and that according to his recently opened will, the bulk of his property would be given to the citizens of Rome. Then, he brought out Caesar's blood-stained toga and held it for all to see, pointing to each stab hole in the fabric and naming the assassin. Here, Cassius. Here, Brutus. The inflamed masses rioted, looting the shopping pavilions and building a massive funeral pyre for the body of Caesar. Then they turned on the liberators, who were forced to flee the city while the angry mobs overran their homes. Of course, Octavius soon learned that Antony's speech had been full of exaggerated showmanship. The bulk of the Caesar estate had not been left to the citizens of Rome. It had been left to him. Though the estate was not technically left to Gaius Octavius, it was instead left to Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's posthumously adopted son. What role would Octavius have in the new post-Caesar world? How about one right smack dab in the middle of everything? His mother begged him to refuse the adoption and inheritance. She understood perfectly well what it meant to be Caesar's sole heir, what would be expected of him, and what enemies he would immediately earn. If he took Caesar's name, in all likelihood, he would share his uncle's fate. But weak and fragile Octavius revealed some of the steel lurking in his heart and rejected this advice. No, he would become Gaius Julius Caesar, avenge his late father, and guarantee the dictator's legacy. At this point, Octavius apparently dropped his old name altogether, and henceforth went by simply Gaius Julius Caesar, the name that would rouse the passion and loyalty of his newly inherited allies. His old name Octavius, amended to Octavianus to denote that he had been adopted out of his biological family, was still officially attached to his identity, but in practice it disappeared. However, historians label the new Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian through this period, simply to avoid confusing him with his dead uncle. So, just to recap, before the adoption, we call him Octavius. After the adoption, but before he wins the Civil War, we call him Octavian. After the triumph over Mark Antony, we call him Augustus, a title conferred on him by the Senate in 27 BC. His friends, however, called him Gaius, while everyone else called him Julius Caesar. Got that? Good. Octavian was hailed by Caesar's legions in Brundisium as their rightful new leader, much to the chagrin of Antony. But it was not just the name of Caesar that drew the legions to support Octavian so readily. Having run the assassins out of town, Antony's posture suddenly became conciliatory. He met with the Senate and appeared to be arranging a truce, amnesty for the liberators in exchange for the Senate's promise not to cancel any of Caesar's reforms or